whose work needs to be viewed with nuance.
What she's done over 100 years later has kept this story fresh and interesting, and that's why we're here.
The final resting place of Sir Richard and Lady Isabel Burton is in Mortlake, southwest London. The Burton Mausoleum has a striking presence in the graveyard of St Mary Magdalen Roman Catholic Church.
If you were to step inside in the 19th century, firstly you would come into the churchyard, a very modest Catholic churchyard, and be faced with this huge mausoleum. It towers over everything else in the churchyard. You push on the door because it was open, and it was designed to be open for any members of the public to come and pay their respects.
Burton's mausoleum, of course, is spectacular when viewed through modern lens, for sure. But even by Victorian standards, and we all know the Victorians loved a dramatic mausoleum.
There's a story of when the funeral happened and when people started to visit, visitors would say, "Oh, why have the stonemasons not taken the canvas off their building?" Only to find out that it was the stone itself, which is quite a nice little story. Who knows if it's true. He dies in 1890, and the funeral in Mortlake happens in 1891. A couple of years later, she publishes her biography of his life. So that's a very big and formal piece of storytelling. The mausoleum is something that is tangible, and you can stand there and look at it and engage with. It's a building that asks lots of questions.
He's in a Catholic cemetery. He's in a Bedouin tent.
Isabel designed the mausoleum to reflect the couple's happiest time, travelling the deserts when Richard was consul in Syria. The inspiration of the design comes from the tents used by nomadic peoples outside Damascus.
And I think that's really wonderfully fitting. Just like the man himself, the mausoleum is religiously deeply ambiguous, and you just haven't got a clue who's actually lying inside. Then you have the wonderful symbolism along the trim of the sandstone tent, the beautiful gold shimmering, almost shimmering crescent and star, which also, by the way, is something Islam took from Christianity, because when the Ottomans finally conquered Constantinople, it was part of the banner Byzantium Constantinople, and it's from that moment that the Muslims adopt it. So it's quite poetic. That's the symbol Burton chose to go with, because of course by the 19th century the crescent and the star had become very much associated with Islam and not Eastern Christianity. And then when we look in the tent itself, we have many of Richard and Lady Isabel's effects that are both from the Catholic and Christian world and the Muslim world. One of the most iconic hanging in the middle is the hand of Fatima, which again is this wonderfully fluid artifact that transcends religion as well, because the hand of Fatima is also known as the Hamsa and makes its way into some Judaic cultures, especially the North African ones. Because it was designed by Isabel, she did ensure the hierarchy in the way things were positioned, makes it clear to those who inspect it closely that the crucifix is above the Islamic symbolism.
It was decided that a stonemasons firm called Messrs Dyke & Sons would complete the project, and they were based out of Highgate, which is rather a long way from Mortlake, so it's kind of unusual that she didn't pick somewhere more local, and we're not entirely sure why that firm was chosen over somebody else, but they've done a fantastic job. It's a really dynamic design, like the folds of the canvas seem to be rippling in the wind even now. It was a very sensory environment, so when you pushed open the door there was a battery system, and you open the door and a switch in the door frame would send an electric signal and it would shake 4 strings of camel bells suspended in the ceiling. You have all of these sounds around you, you've got the smells of incense and candles and oil lamps, and it's so colourful in there. The painting on the walls, there was a colourful stained glass window, which unfortunately no longer exists, colourful glass lanterns, paintings, gold lanterns with coloured glass in it that when you lit the candles inside would have glowed just a beautiful light. It was a full bodily experience, and she really did think of everything. The story goes that Richard was afraid of the dark and he hated being in complete darkness, and even when they travelled together across the world, he always made sure that he had some access to light, to the moon and to the stars. And she wanted to make sure that he wasn't fully enclosed in a dark stone mausoleum. She wanted light, she wanted natural light to come in, and the stained glass window would have made it a beautiful colour inside.
The mausoleum brings to London very much of the atmosphere of the Burtons' house in Trieste, where visitors said that the house was divided into two parts. There was the Muslim part where Sir Richard spent most of his time, and the Catholic part, obviously organised by Isabel. And now that they buried here in Mortlake, we can see the mausoleum itself represents these two strands, the Catholicism from Isabel and the very, very strong interest in Islam and the Islamic world from the part of Captain Sir Richard Francis Burton.
Here we have Sir Richard Burton's coffin, and it is a steel coffin with gilded details made in Trieste in Austro-Hungary before it was sent back. He was embalmed, so Isabel chose to also be embalmed to be able to be above ground with him. And she's in a much more plain mahogany coffin on this side with the Virgin Mary and Christ. So this is the only object we know for a fact came from the Burtons' house in Trieste. It's a mosque lamp, in the Mamluk revival style. It's not anything particularly fancy, but it would have been made in Damascus or Cairo. The reason that we know that it was in their house in Trieste is there's a photograph of it hanging in Isabel's private Catholic chapel. So this mosque lamp was used in her very Catholic space. Here we have the most exciting object in the mausoleum. It's a portrait, it's a miniature of Sir Richard Burton. We know very little about it, who painted it or when it was painted, but he is in military dress, so possibly the 1850s. But what we do have is this wonderful account that during their 10-year courtship, they carried portraits of one another. So when Richard came back from searching for the source of the River Nile, they both showed each other these portraits in pristine condition. This is undoubtedly the one that Isabel carried in her pocket.
Lady Isabel never stopped adding to the mausoleum. In 1893, with the proceeds of her biography, Sir Richard Burton, she purchased camel bells.
During the 5 years between the mausoleum being built and Isabel's death, she was continually adding to the mausoleum and changing it. One of the things she added were these camel bells that hang from the ceiling. In 1894, Isabel wrote a letter to her friend saying, "With my earnings from her biography on Sir Richard Burton, I'm embellishing his mausoleum, and I'm putting up in honour of his poem, Qasida, festoons of camel bells from the desert in the roof of the tent where he lies, so that when I open or shut the door, or at the elevation of the mast, the tinkling of the camel bell will sound just as it does in the desert."
Illustrates another aspect of Burton, a very, very minor one, but quite interesting. His appreciation for technology, cutting-edge technology, as it was for the 1890s. In Trieste, they were among the first people to have a telephone installed in their house. When they were in Ireland, Burton offered to record on an early phonograph the Muslim call to prayer, which was, if you like, his party piece in the country house parties he went to.
Isabel was also, in those 5 years, she was coming in here and holding seances and praying, and so, of course, her coffin wouldn't have been here. There would have been rugs, possibly some cushions, And this manual wheel is exactly the right height for her to be ringing the bells during her seances.
Sir Richard Burton died in October 1890 in their house in Trieste.
To all intents and purposes, he lived without any reference to his Christian upbringing, with Sir Lady Isabel to be baptised. And so the love that Sir Richard and Lady Isabel had for one another meant that even at his deathbed, he'd agreed to be able to be fully received into the church. Though he's certainly a controversial figure, only his exact choices are known to him and God alone. Socially, it would have been part of the bedrock that allowed their love to flourish. Lady Isabel was the really force of nature that she was. It's wonderful that one of the ways that they describe her devotion to him, alive or dead, was a veritable passion. It appeared in every detail. What others would have called the dedication of the biography, she called the consecration.
So Richard had been ill for a long time, and he and Isabel had discussions about where they thought his final resting place should be. They thought that a figure such as himself deserved the grandeur of a state funeral at St. Paul's Cathedral or Westminster Abbey, but they had other ideas. So when they were refused there, Richard said to Isabel, "In that case, I'd like to lie side by side with you in a tent forever." So they came to Mortlake, and Isabel built him this.
Lady Isabel had a strong connection with Mortlake. She had visited her aunt's home there when she was young, and there is an Arundel tomb next to the church for several members of her family.
In 1891, Isabel moved back to London, where she spent the rest of her life split between lodgings in Baker Street and in Mortlake, in a house she shared with her sister Elizabeth Fitzgerald just next to the church.
Isabel visited the mausoleum regularly for the rest of her life.
She visited whenever she could to sit and read and pray, and she talks about when she's sitting in there with him that children would run through the churchyard and come and say a little prayer and then run off again.
Isabel's sister had lost her husband in 1891, and the sisters clearly shared a very special bond, with Elizabeth interred into the mausoleum in 1902.
Isabel intended the mausoleum to be a lasting testament to her husband, and a place that followers of his could pay their respects. Unfortunately, in the 1950s, the mausoleum was vandalised.
By the 1950s, the Burton Mausoleum was in a poor state. The window was smashed in by vandals and the door was damaged. This meant that we completely lost any idea of what the stained glass window looked like, and it completely transformed our relationship with the building. It was no longer accessible for people to be inside. In the 70s, they put in a door infill that replicated what had been there before, and they put the ladder and a clear glass window at the back. However, the building was completely inaccessible until 2026, when the door was reinstated.
And as I speak again behind me, Sir Richard is shown as a medieval knight and praying. He's facing to the east, to Jerusalem, but of course obviously to Mecca as well. Though he's on record as really detracting against all religions at times, he also is on record of being able to support them. His own faith, we hardly know. We believe that all people are able to be open to God's mercy, and that we have the tradition, which is a biblical tradition, of being able to pray for those who have died and to be able to help them in their journey to God. I don't think, whilst it would have been seen as certainly unique, that it would have necessarily, through Lady Isabel's champion of it, have been voices that would have prevented it. We don't have any archival evidence of opposition to it. If you look very closely at the face of Sir Richard and his droopy moustache, a much more grizzled and elderly photo of Sir Richard shows him with a scar on his cheek. You'll see in the window above where St. Joseph's face, if you chopped the bottom of the beard away, then you'll see the element of St. Joseph's face is the face of Sir Richard. Lady Isabel's face is shown in the face of St. Agnes. The reason why St. Agnes is there is because her feast day is the 21st of January. Lady Isabel and Sir Richard were married on the 22nd of January, and so we remember them every year on their anniversary.
This building is the legacy that she leaves of Richard, was the point, but also of her. It's something that, because it's so unique, it asks lots of questions, and visitors are so fascinated and they want to know more about it. Why is it here? Why does it look like that? What's inside? What she's done over 100 years later has kept this story fresh and interesting, and that's why we're here. We get funding to do it, the conservation, we want to open it up to more visitors. So her whole intention of being a wife, bolstering his reputation and making him a public figure, she continues to do that every day. Every time someone walks into the churchyard and looks at it and goes, oh, I wonder what that is, and or looks it up and does a bit of research, she is doing what she wanted to do throughout her entire life.
The items themselves are not necessarily of intrinsically that much value, but just the connection is given me to Richard and Isabel, and the sense that Richard Burton from 200 years ago is echoes of his life are being carried down through the years and are inspiring people today, inspiring people to learn more about history, more about religion, and understanding people from different walks of life, different cultures.
The mausoleum has been here for over 130 years, and it is still raising questions.
When looking at this mausoleum, you can't separate it from its historical context. The 19th century was a period of massive British presence across the world, influencing ideas in Orientalism, in arts, in culture, in building and in objects. This mausoleum is absolutely a reflection of that attitude. It represents both Richard and Isabel's love affair with the Middle East, as well as global conversations about imperialism.
And because he was so pivotal in the way in which Western culture still perceives cultures across South Asia, Africa, the Arabian world, we don't have a choice but to revisit Burton and the impact his work has had. There's just no two ways about it. This is why this project was so important, because he is one of those iconic, pivotal figures who had a huge impact on Western perception of certain Eastern cultures. And because the Western perception is the dominant perception in today's world, we have to engage with this.
This building is incredibly unique to Richard and Isabel, but it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's both a reflection of their lives, their travels and their interests, as well as broader and bigger stories about globalism, expansionism, imperialism, and cultural relationships, how we can look at those histories and why they're still relevant today.